Good morning, class. I'm here today, Tuesday, April 21st, to record our first YouTube lesson of the week about the history of voting rights. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and start the lesson. So today's lesson is the history of voting rights, and it's lesson 3, Tuesday, April 21st. This is our third week of video lessons about this unit. Our guiding question for this unit is, what makes someone a leader of change? You all answered this question in assignment 2 weeks ago after reading the timeline, Voting in America. And in your answers, some of you shared things like how if someone believes in something and they stand up for what they believe in, they can be an example for others. And in that way, they can be a leader of change. Crystal even used Rosa Parks in her answer, and I thought that was a really great example. So I want you to keep this question in the back of your mind as we move through this whole unit, not only today, but all the lessons about voting rights in America. You should be asking yourself, what is this teaching me, or how am I thinking about what makes someone a leader of change? Our learning target today is, I can determine the important events in United States history that helped to develop women's right to vote using a timeline. So this is what you should be able to do or say or know by the end of today's lesson. That's the target. All right, so yesterday you guys did this assignment right here, Voting History Timeline, Monday on Google Classroom. So you read through the timeline and you picked out events that you thought had to do with the women's suffrage movement. And then the second question, you picked out 5 that you thought were the most important events on the timeline pertaining to the women's suffrage movement. In today's lesson, we will review yesterday's assignment and make our own timeline. So you won't need to reopen this assignment, but this was what yesterday's assignment looked like. If you have not done it, if you did not get to it yesterday, you need to pause this lesson right here and make sure that you go back and do it, because today's lesson builds off of yesterday's work. So today we'll review yesterday's assignment and make our own timelines. Okay. There we go. So let's start by reviewing yesterday's work. And you can open yours up right now if you'd like, but you don't need to. We're going to look at this together and identify the events on the timeline that have to do with women's suffrage movement. So we'll start with the 18th century. It says most of the colonies have some form of elected government. Only property owners can vote. In some colonies, voting is restricted based on race, sex, and religion, but the most important qualification is wealth. So this I actually will identify as pertaining to the women's rights movement, because it says that voting is restricted, and we know that restricted means limited based on race, sex, and religion. And in this use, sex means gender, so that has to do with women. So to show that this is having to do with the women's rights movement, I'm actually going to just highlight it for this lesson. 1776, the Declaration of Independence, written by slave owner Thomas Jefferson, states that all men are created equal. This is certainly interesting, but you could argue it both ways, I suppose, that all men are created equal. Did they mean mankind and then include women, or did they strictly mean men? We'll leave it for now. 1777, women lose the right to vote in New York. That certainly has to do with the women's rights movement, just like 1780, women lose the right to vote in Massachusetts. So we should be identifying all of these. Women lose the right to vote in New Hampshire, absolutely. 1787, the U.S. Constitution is ratified. It gives each state the right to determine the qualifications for voting. Most states restrict voting to male property holders over the age of 21. Some states bar free African Americans from voting, and we discussed previously what bar means, right? That they denied them the right to vote. So for 1778, the Declaration of Independence, 1787, right here, it says that most states restrict voting to male property holders. That does indeed tell us that women could not vote. And you know, I actually am going to highlight this because the Declaration of Independence is quite important, not only because it states that men are created equal, but it also was the point at which that America became its own country and therefore started building its own laws. So we're going to highlight that as well. 1801, residents of Washington, D.C. lose the right to vote. 1807, women lose the right to vote in New Jersey, the last state to allow women the right to vote. So I'm going to highlight that because it says women lose the right to vote. 1848, the Women's Rights Convention takes place in Seneca Falls. We actually read about that in an article previously. Absolutely has to do with women's right to vote. 1856, North Carolina ends the wealth requirement for voting, the last state to do so. 1867, the 14th Amendment makes African American citizens, but defines voters as male. This, I would say, does have to do with women and voting. Even though it doesn't help them get the vote, it defines voters as male. So that means that women are not defined as voters. 1870, the 15th Amendment gives African American males the right to vote. Males. 1878, Congress rejects the Susan B. Anthony vote. That was quite important. That came right from Susan B. Anthony. 1880s, the Chinese Exclusion Act denies Chinese American citizenship. 1887, the Dawes General Allotment Act states that Native Americans can only vote if they resign from their tribes. 1898, the U.S. Supreme Court rules that U.S.-born children of immigrants are citizens. 1920, the 19th Amendment gives women the right to vote. Oh, that is very important. 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act makes Native American citizens with the right to vote. 1943, the Chinese Exclusion Act is repealed. Chinese Americans gain the right to vote. 1946, Filipinos gain the right to vote, to become U.S. citizens and to vote. 1952, the McCarran-Walter Act gives first-generation Japanese Americans the right to become U.S. citizens and to vote. 1961, the 23rd Amendment gives residents of Washington, D.C. the right to vote in presidential elections only. 1964, the 24th Amendment eliminates poll taxes, which had been used to restrict voting in the South. 1965, the Voting Rights Act eliminates so-called literacy tests, which had been used to keep African Americans from voting in some southern states, and gives the federal government power to oversee voter registration and fair elections in some areas. 1971, the 26th Amendment lowers the voting age from 21 to 18 nationwide. 1973, the Home Rule Act gives residents of Washington, D.C. the right to elect a mayor and city council. 1974, the Supreme Court rules that states may deny felons the right to vote. And lastly, 1978, Congress passes the D.C. Voting Rights Amendment, which would have given Washington, D.C. residents representation in Congress, but only 16 states ratified it. So none of these at the end pertain specifically or particularly to women, so I'm not going to highlight any of these. So this shows that we found quite a few events on the timeline that really made an impact on the women's rights movement. The first one being 18th century, 1776, 1777, 1780, 1784, 1787, 1807, 1848, 1867, 1878, and 1920. So yesterday, those are some of the ones that we should have written in this box number 1. Then you should have narrowed it down to just 5 of those most important events. And today we'll look at how to do that together. So please make sure that you now have open the assignment from Google Classroom today. It's called Women's Suffrage Movement Timeline. And this is not on a Word doc, this is on a drawings doc because we are making our own timeline. So please either pause my presentation right now and go open it up, or make sure that you already have it open. History of Voting in America, Women's Suffrage Movement Timeline. It's the second assignment on Google Classroom today, Tuesday. All right. We should all have that open now, and I'm also going to open that up. On this timeline, we will follow along, and then you can see there's actually directions. It says follow along with your teacher's YouTube lesson, that's me, to type in the description of each event on your timeline. Double click inside the box to type. So now we're going to actually identify the 5 most important events from the timeline and type them into this timeline so that we can look at it in a form straight across with the chronological order. That means in order of when things happened in time. So in order to type inside these boxes, you do need to double click. And then you'll want to move the cursor after the year to begin typing. So the first item on our timeline is actually from 1776, and it is when the Declaration of Independence was ratified. So here we'll write the Declaration of Independence is, and states all men are created equal. So that from the beginning shows that our Declaration of Independence, when the United States was formed, thought that all men are created equal. So that either means 2 things, right? That could mean that they thought just men are all created equal, or that mankind, like humankind, are all created equal. And if that's the case, that means women are equal as well. The next event that's one of the 5 most important events from our timeline is the event in 1787, and that is the Constitution of the United States. So that is when we passed the Constitution. And so we'll write the U.S. Constitution is ratified. And remember, that's a word from the glossary that we identified in some earlier lessons, and ratified actually means approved. So we'll add this in here so that we make sure we know and we understand what this means. It says it gives the right, it gives states the right to choose who can vote. Most states choose only men who own property. So this is really important because it sets a tone from the beginning that states can have the right to choose who gets to vote in their elections in their state. So that actually means that California, the state of California, can choose who votes in California. The state of Texas can choose who votes in Texas. And it doesn't need to be the same everywhere in the country. And then this note here that most states choose only men who own property. That means that from the beginning, women were being excluded from elections. The next important event that we'll add is the event from 1848, the Women's Rights Convention. The Women's Rights Convention takes place in Seneca Falls, New York. So you should be typing these in with me as I type each event into the box on your assignment from Google Classroom. So we read about the Women's Rights Convention actually several weeks ago in the article called Women in the Fight for Equality. And we learned about how Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott started this convention and held the first one in Seneca Falls in 1848. Next, we'll move on to 1878. This was important as well. This was the event where Congress rejects, which means refuses to accept, the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. So this was actually an attempt from Susan B. Anthony and a lot of the people that she was working with to add an amendment to the Constitution that would give women the right to vote, and it did not pass. It was rejected by Congress in 1878. And then all the way up in 1920, so that is 42 years later, we can finally add that the 19th Amendment was passed, and it gives women the right to vote. So we see an attempt to get women the right to vote using an amendment that did not work, and then we finally saw the amendment that was passed in 1920. That is 100 years ago. Great. So make sure that you've typed all of these into your assignment today. That is how I'm going to know that you've watched my YouTube lesson, that you've taken in this information, and you've gotten to review the work from yesterday. The rest of this unit will primarily focus on what happened between 1850, so right after the Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, and up until 1920. So we'll now be looking right in this timeline between 1850 and 1920. Make sure that you have written all of these down on your assignment, and then don't forget to turn in the assignment at the top. Tomorrow's lesson will be an article on Google Classroom, and then Thursday you have another YouTube lesson to go with the assignment from tomorrow. As always, you can text me if you have any questions. Today I'll be looking that you've typed in these events on your assignment page and turned in the assignment. All right, have a great day.